This is a gift from the government of Barbados to the people of Barbados to be shared and enjoyed by anyone from anywhere around the world who may visit Barbados. This is our National Botanical Gardens. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. In this six-part series, you will be introduced to the concept of a National Botanical Garden, the benefits of such a garden, the reason why this location here at Waterford was selected, the layout of the garden, and the hopes and expectations. Of course, we will also be looking at the legacy. As always, we will begin by placing things in historical perspective.
Botanical gardens have a very long, rich history of existence dating back to 1544, when the first garden was developed in the Italian city of Pisa. Even though some renowned scientists speak to Padilla, another Italian city, of having the first botanical gardens.
The whole idea of a botanic garden is one that excites a lot of people. The history of them, in many instances, is steeped in our colonial past in terms of how people would have organized for fruits and vegetables and plants, diversification and scientific research. Also, too, it's steep in terms of palaces and gardens and grounds. People would have an extended garden around the residence, and that would be a botanic garden as such.
Most of the, if not all of the existing gardens in our region are old landscape features because these properties were once owned by state governors, or wealthy plantation managers, and very prominent families in their respective countries. So that if you were to tour botanical gardens through the regions, for example, in the Dominican Republic, or Puerto Rico, or Jamaica, Trinidad, you'd recognize that the mature trees on these landscapes are sometimes as old as 300-400 years old, which speaks to the issue of longevity and how long they were existing on the landscape. Now, here in Barbados, it's a little different because we started from scratch. And we charted a new path because we have not inherited any botanical landscape.
Now, most of you, when you hear botanical gardens, you think in terms of Andromeda, established by Iris, Branch, Bailey, Bannockey. But here we have in Barbados this botanical gardens, which is a centerpiece of the Ministry of Environment.
And this exercise here, I would say, should be a very interesting and adventurous journey.
As we continue on that adventure, let us step back further and get a better sense of the origins of botanical gardens. You will recognize that these were learning laboratories, places of scientific research, which laid the foundation for modern science.
Right after we, as a species, man, left his hunter-gatherer nomadic lifestyles and we started to domesticate seeds to get the wheat, the fruits that made up part of our diet, we quickly got along to the parts where we were allowed to create structures within our villages that then became our towns and cities, both, especially in that ancient context, as well as build political systems that help us to increase the quantity of food production. So basically, short after that period, we became fascinated with all things in the study of what we would now call botany. In those times, we've had ancient gardens in places that occupy the popular lore and myth of Babylonia and the Assyrian kingdoms in the Middle East and the Fertile Crescent. And it is within that context that, as the scientist of those times, which science is simply the, dare I say, the art of observation and noting one's observations. So in a way, art, when you think of someone who would sit down here and paint a landscape, those can be used in retrospect as a historical account of what some of the seeds were around, some of the plants were around, vegetation that was around. So such is the early beginnings of the study of botany and how it related to botanical gardens. So from there, we take a leap forward in history and we come forward to the creations of the first set of botanical gardens for what can be considered the post-biblical period. So in the 1500s, 1540, 41, you had the University of Padova in Italy. That was one of the first entities. Universities were invented in Alexandria in Egypt just over 1,000 years ago. So with that time, as they became centers of learning, as man expanded his knowledge of various faraway places and study and reading and writing, all this predates the printing press. That's when books were still handwritten. You have a situation where, like I said, in the 1500s was the interest in creating botanical gardens. At that point in time, we would all remember that, in 1492, Columbus sailed the oceans blue. So you had now this venturing into the new world that brought ever more species of plants, of both flora and fauna, to the sensibilities of what was the known world at the time, which is Africa, Middle East, Far East, and Europe. So such was the establishment of these botanical gardens. You had them established there in Florence, and then by the 16th and 17th and 18th century, they expanded throughout all of what is Western Europe. They were established for study the seeds, and also in those times, this is just basically at the beginning of the advent of the not just man's discovery of the wider world and the world not being flat anymore, but also the idea of the commercialization of what is it that nature can provide us with. So botanical gardens actually were started as laboratories, scientific research-based laboratories in which one could study all that one needed to with regards to the plants, their cycles, the various ways they seeds. You had the differences between herbariums, succulents, the various plants that were coming in from the new colonies. All of these, and then along with that, you also coupled that some plants, because they came from areas outside of the cold that would be associated with mid-16th and 17th and 18th century Europe, was also the advent of the greenhouses that were necessary to maintain these plants in these temperate climates. So therefore was more study, and you can just imagine that they were also doing a lot of examining of some of the medicinal properties of these plants and how they could help societies of that time. So such was the beginnings of the modern botanical gardens, and such would be their history for the next almost 400 years, through to the early 1900s.
Let us bring it home to Barbados now and get a sense of the development of gardens here on the island.
The history of gardens and gardening in Barbados is absolutely fascinating. We have to remember that people coming from a cold country like England, familiar with the plants of Britain, coming to Barbados, amazed by this tropical verdure, by the huge tropical trees, the colorful flowers, they were fascinated. But they also had a perspective that plants were full of wonderful uses. They were interested in the nature of the wood that could be used, and of the leaves and the flowers that had medicinal value. So with that perspective, they were tremendously interested, and they documented what they saw. They drew them and they wrote about them. So Richard Ligon, who came to Barbados in 1647 to escape being put in debtor's prison after supporting King Charles I, he came and he went back to Britain, and while he was imprisoned for his debts, he wrote this wonderful book about the history of Barbados, and he illustrated it with pictures, drawings of the cabbage palm tree and the pawpaw and the pineapple and so on. And then we have another even better, more magnificent book, perhaps the most amazing book ever produced in Barbados, up until this day, was the book by the Reverend Griffith Hughes. And his book, The Natural History of Barbados, spent a series of long chapters, which he called books from, I think, book 4 to book 10, describing all of the plants as he saw the classification in his day in the 1740s. And so he was fascinated totally by plants. But many people were fascinated by what the plants could do. And so the oldest garden we have in Barbados illustrates that. It's the garden at St. Nicholas Abbey. Now, the house that became St. Nicholas Abbey is built from a house plan that was available in Britain in the 1650s, and the house was built, and there was a front wall somewhat removed from the house itself, and the garden was laid out in front of the house and down the right-hand side of the house. And the front of the house would have been for decoration and enjoyment and appreciation, but on the right-hand side was a formal herb garden. And every manor house in Britain would have had a herb garden in which the important medicinal plants would have been grown. No doubt, many people, when sugar was profitable, really profitable in the 18th century, developed gardens, but not a lot of them survive in any meaningful way. I think that the most prominent one would have been Cottonwood College. Now remember, the college was built and opened initially as a school, but around these wonderful buildings. And at some point in time, the spring that brought the water down through the college grounds was used to create an ornamental lake. Silk cotton trees were planted, flowering trees were planted everywhere, and the great strength of the Cottonwood Gardens was the palms, a great variety of palms in front of the college building, and then the cabbage palms on the lawns at the back leading down towards the Atlantic and looking north. And so Cottonwood College Garden was mentioned by Sir Robert Schomburgk, who wrote the great history of Barbados, published in 1848. And he said, why don't we make Cottonwood College into a botanical garden? Now, there didn't seem to be great interest in the botanical garden in Barbados. What had happened was that the Governor Lord Seaforth, in the early part of the 19th century, at Government House, had a friend who was a botanist and who went collecting plants. And no doubt he took some to the early botanical garden of the 1750s in St. Vincent, but he brought plants to Lord Seaforth, and Government House was planted up beautifully. So there are all sorts of big trees at Government House, and there would have been many distantly located shrubs introduced. The prize of Government House, of course, is the cannonball tree. It's the biggest, greatest, most beautiful cannonball tree, which produces lots of flowers and lots of cannonballs. So there was perhaps the feeling of the governor, well, I have the botanical garden in the back of my house. There's no need, really no need for a botanical garden. And that's a great pity, because Barbadians then did not have the opportunity of enjoying that garden as they do in St. Vincent. An Englishman called James Anthony Froude came to Barbados on a visit, and he wrote about the Caribbean, and he visited Government House. And he described the gardens at Government House with eloquent words, and he was particularly enthusiastic about what he called the grotto. And the grotto is what I would call a large fernery, because by the Victorian era there was a passion in Britain for ferns, and all of the great houses had conservatories where their ferns were grown. And so the lady of the house would have taken her guests to see the magnificent ferns. Some of the guests might not have seen them before. So a fernery was something exotic and very special. And one of the governors obviously decided to develop this grotto, which has very, very thick coral stone rubble walls. So it goes back clearly to at least the era of Lord Seaforth. And I suspect it would have been Lord Seaforth who built it. It would have been covered with some sort of semi-shade, perhaps planks, wire, I'm not sure. All of that is gone. And in the middle was a fountain. And Froude described this grotto as being a most magical place, with the fountain playing in the center and the birds twittering and the fireflies and the lovely colors of the orchids and so on. He was in his element describing the grotto at Government House. gardens. The other great garden of the 19th century was Farley Hill. It was the rival, if you like, to the Government House Garden. Now, Farley Hill was developed by Sir Graham Briggs. He was one of those people whose father had made some money recently, and he bought and gave him Grenade Hall, as it was then called, and he called it Farley Hill. And he was a horticulturist, and he developed a great garden. So there are magnificent trees along the outer perimeter of the property, mostly mahogany trees, but a number of other exotic tropical trees and shrubs, as well as the formal garden at the south front of the house. And that was again a formal Victorian garden laid out with garden beds and shrubs and big trees on the side. It has not been maintained, of course, because Farley Hill has not been maintained. So most of that garden has gone. There are a few of the old plants left, a few Queen of Flowers perhaps, some of the palm trees in that area. But sadly, that magnificent garden, which included the Norfolk pine, he imported the first Norfolk pine into Barbados. And when I was a boy, that Norfolk pine was still there, nearly 100 feet tall, but it obviously has died or has been taken down. So he was an importer of plants and a collector of artifacts of all kinds. And when we were, as children, went to the abandoned Farley Hill before the fire, we walked around and we admired and enjoyed the Farley Hill Garden. But right across Barbados in the early 20th century was known in Barbados for the number of plantation houses that had gardens, and some of the townhouses. People then started to develop gardens, perhaps modelled on the Farley Hill and Government House. Now, Farley Hill had its natural garden area with the big trees and the lawns, and then its formal garden laid out with paths and stones demarcating the beds. So by the mid-Victorian era, that was the model for the gardens. Formally laid out beds, and they would have had the tube roses here and the other roses there and something else, and maybe some plumbago hedges demarcating things. And ferneries became a passion. So the Barbados Garden all included a fernery. And the gardening in that era of the 1920s was very much promoted, even before that, by Lady Gilbert Carter. Sir Gilbert Thomas Gilbert Carter, when he came to Barbados, he was simply Sir Thomas Carter, but he introduced the hyphenation in his name, so he became Sir Gilbert Thomas Gilbert-Carter. And his wife was a much younger woman who was both an artist and an architect by professional training, and she loved gardening as well as designing houses. So she was the designer of Queen's Park, and that produced the very first of our public gardens. So she laid out the walkways, and she had the little lake designed in the shape of Barbados, and the gazebo was put in, the bandstand, and all of that was the design of Lady Gilbert Carter. And because they had lived in Nigeria, and her husband had been sent there to exterminate the slave trade that was still going on in Africa, in Nigeria, up until the 1880s and 90s. And so he was sent there in 1890, and he built a little fort at a place called Ilaro, which was on the slave route, bringing slaves from the interior down to the coast in the 1880s. And Ilaro is therefore the basis of the name of the house that they built subsequently, which became Ilaro Court. But because of her African connection through her husband, she included in the design of Queen's Park the little African hut, which sadly is dilapidated and it's now fenced off, and that's really sad. That needs to be restored, and it would not take a great deal to restore it. And it could be done by the youth groups, by volunteers. It could easily be put back in shape as a symbol of our connection with Africa. But she created at Ilaro Court a magnificent garden. The Ilaro Court property, I think, is something like 11 acres. So she created a lily pond down the area below the house, where apparently she and her husband would have their rum punches in the afternoon. The lily pond was surrounded by plants, and then right across the hillside she had extensive walkways and shrubs of every kind. And that garden went to pieces, as did the house. And when Owen Arthur was Prime Minister, Mrs. Arthur was a keen gardener. So she redeveloped the garden, she restored it, she put in all sorts of new plants, and the NCC assisted her both with the provision of plants and the maintenance of the garden at Alaracourt. So it is now one of our finest gardens and one that the public can enjoy. I suspect that when they go to hear music or to a function, they don't have much time to enjoy the garden. I remember talking to the extremely well-informed gardeners who were doing a little weeding down in the corner, and it was next to the Pentas. And this was a wonderful discussion that we had, because the Pentas is one of those African plants that was introduced to Barbados from Africa. And it is a plant that the African people believed had all-purpose uses in medicine. They thought it was a cure-all for everything. So there's that little garden plant that we thought was rather insignificant with its tiny pink, purple and white flowers, the Pentas. And apparently it was brought here as a cure-all for all kinds of diseases from malaria back down. So Alaracourt is one of the wonderful gardens, and it certainly rivals Government House, and I think it's more interesting in terms of the variety in recent times than Government House. But it was Iris Banachie who created a fervor for gardens in Barbados, and she, when she acquired her family property down at Bathsheba, created Andromeda Gardens. And Andromeda Gardens is fascinating because it is a hillside garden and it had a stream running through. Now that stream has been curbed to some extent. It is thought that a combination of earth movement and people taking off the water higher up the hill has stopped the stream from flowing profusely.
And it used to be fed by a stream from the spring of the river, the spring that feeds this little river. This pool was fed by that until the terrible flood of 1970. If you will remember, we had 28 inches of rain in 24 hours, and it devastated that particular spring, which changed course. After that, then we had to use a traditional pump and put in a recirculating system, so the water is never changed, it's only topped up, often by the rain.
But she had a stream running right through, and then she created a wonderful lily pond, and she developed 6 acres out of the 8 acres as Botanical Garden. And that was back in the 1950s, and she introduced plants from all over the world. So it has all of the indigenous Barbadian plants, but it also has lots of introductions. Up at the top are all the plants like breadfruit tree, down at the bottom are travelers' palms or travelers' trees, and in between is just about everything you can think of, because she was such a fantastic green-fingered gardener. And it is said that she also had the technique of carrying in her handbag a pair of clippers, so that any plants that she saw when no one was looking, she would slip out her clipper and take off something, you see, and then she'd have another plant back at Andromeda. So she started the public garden craze, and that has been extended because it was Don Hill from the Light and Power Company who bought the little plantation Richmond in St. Joseph, and that became the Flower Forest. And around the same time, Richard Colin, an Englishman living in Barbados, he not only assisted Don in the design of the landscaping at the Flower Forest, but he then designed the orchid world. So that was our next public garden. And then there's Anthony Hunt, who came from a gardening family, grew up at Balls with a garden, created Hunt's Nurseries, and then he acquired Castle Grant and created the magnificent Hunt's Gardens. And each of these public gardens is very different. You have Andromeda, the hillside garden, which concentrates on a prolixity of plants and herbs of every kind, with a few big trees. You have the Flower Forest, which is more of an arboretum, with the huge cabbage palm trees that were always there, and lots of color. So the emphasis at the Flower Forest is not huge variety, but color and vistas. And so people love to photograph that as well. And then you have the orchid world, which specializes in its orchids. And the location there is a magnificent one because it has the shade from the morning sun to the east. It's been created in an old quarry, so it has humidity, it has shade from the morning sun, so it gets a limited amount of sun, but strong exposure to the western sun. And the orchids are the great emphasis, but there's a lot of other features within Orchid World. And then you have the latest one, the Petria Gardens, down near Whole Town. I don't know if you've been there. But Petria Gardens, again, is very different. It's on a flat landscape, and there are a lot of water features in Petria. So that is like a mini botanical garden with quite a lot of variety and lots to photograph. And so all of those public gardens are of interest. They've all developed over a period of about 20 years. Then, of course, there are the private gardens all over Barbados. And the oldest of the private gardens that I can think of would be Villanova, because Villanova was built as Villanova the New House in 1833, and it was laid out on 14 acres of what is now mostly woodland. There is the great house, there is the aborted attempt to make a historic country inn, which worked very well for about 8 years, and the buildings are all still there. There is the great house that was built on the lawn, and when it was the home of the parochial medical officer, those gardens were at their peak. They were absolutely magnificent. Again, there are water features, statuary, and every kind of tree and shrub that you can think of. And of course it was in the beautiful uplands of St. John, the most beautiful parish in Barbados. So it had just enough rain to make it really, really lush. It has one of the famous cannonball trees, and it has a great deal more. And it's the best of the old gardens that I think is now almost 200 years old. And now we have a government plan for a botanical garden. I think it's going to be much more of an arboretum rather than a full-scale cube garden type garden with all the features that botanical gardens normally have. It's a large open space, it's very large, there are already mature trees there, and it's a kind of place that could well be one of the great, in fact it would be unique as an arboretum in the Caribbean. There are arboreta in various countries where the emphasis is on trees rather than on the little plants that you look at on the ground.
Well, the type of botanical garden expected to rise here on this location will be detailed later in this series. Do join us next week at the same time as we continue on this journey towards a national botanical garden for Barbados. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Thanks for your time.